Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden. I'm Senior Vice President at Tier Memorial Hermann Hospital, and I'm professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center. We have a very interesting show today with a great guest whom I'll introduce to you in just a moment. First, I want to ask you a question, and this is one that we'll get to sometime before the end of today's show. What federal law requires access to private accommodations? We'll talk about those issues in just a minute, but now it's a pleasure for me to introduce John Torkelson. John, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thank you for having me.
Now, John, you're the principal at a company called the Access Partnership, right, but you have many other titles. So first of all, what does the Access Partnership do?
The Access Partnership is a company that is dedicated to code consulting for accessibility. We deal with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the state version, which is the Texas Accessibility Standards or the Texas Architectural Barriers Act. We perform plan reviews and inspections for building owners, for architects, to help them in the design and construction process to make sure that they've complied with not only federal law, but with state law, and specifically with state law as is required by the state of Texas.
Now, after you do your review, is there another review required by the state?
There's not. Well, we do a plan review prior to construction, which is the most important part of what we do, because you don't want to go out and do the inspection, which is required, and find out that they've done something wrong. And so what we'll do is we'll review the plans first and then go out after construction and make sure that it was built correctly.
Does it often happen that mistakes are made in that process?
More often than we would like. You know, the goal is to catch everything, but when we're dealing with a built environment, it's not as perfect as it is in the design environment. And so there are certain circumstances where the architect or the contractor will make a decision that will reduce the accessibility and actually bring an element into non-compliance. And so then we do what we can to work with them to make it accessible.
Now, access involves more than just physical access, more than physical accommodations. Are you also concerned about the issues of hearing impaired and visually impaired people and others?
Right, yeah. One of the misconceptions of people that have in our field is that we're just dealing with wheelchair users, and that's not the case. We're dealing with a broad range, a broad spectrum of disabilities. We're dealing with people with hearing impairments. There are people with mobility impairments that may not be obvious. There may be somebody with a back injury. There may be somebody who uses a walker, a cane, somebody who's hard of hearing, partially sighted. There's a broad range of disabilities that the ADA and the Texas Accessibility Standards encompass. So we're not just dealing with people who are using wheelchairs, but we're dealing with all types of disabilities.
Well, the work that you do in that regard obviously is in great demand. I know you travel all over the United States, right, consulting with both public and private entities?
Correct, yeah. We do, the majority of our work is with private companies, dealing with architects and the building owners. They have a vested goal to make sure that they don't have to go back and correct something, and obviously to stay out of lawsuits. But most of the companies that we work with really want to make sure that their facilities are accessible to people with disabilities. The earlier we can get in and assist them in the process, the less expensive it becomes for them, because they don't have to go back. The worst thing, we're going to show some slides up here, and I'm going to show you some examples of either existing construction or new construction where it wasn't correct, right, where we have a barrier that's there, and then the things that they did to try to solve those things. Usually, once a barrier exists, it's more expensive. It's much more expensive than doing it right the first time, obviously. But then usually the solution becomes somewhat awkward. And you can usually see when somebody has made a mistake that they tried to correct it, but it doesn't look great. And so
you're talking, for example, about the doctor's office I went to recently, where the new building and the ramp appeared to end in the garden as opposed to connecting to a sidewalk.
Right, right. You know, there's that, and then you've got the where they had the accessible parking spaces too far away, and then they had to put new accessible parking spaces in, and then they had to redo the ground where the parking spaces are, because obviously a parking space for a person with a wheelchair is going to need to be flat. You don't want to put your wheelchair outside of the car and then get ready to make the transfer and the wheelchair is rolled off. And so we're looking to, you know, for certain things like that, and one of the slides will show a before and after picture where they had accessible spaces that were on a steep incline, and then they had to come back at a great expense and flatten that area as to where the wheelchair would go and where the parking space was.
Now, John, you said you consult with companies who are doing buildings. What about the architects who are actually doing the buildings? Don't they have a background? Aren't they required to understand barrier-free access?
They do have a background. They are required to understand it. They have a myriad of codes and things that they need to deal with. And especially when we're dealing with specialized facilities like multifamily residential, like hospitals, any large schools, it helps to have somebody who specializes, and architects typically will get a consultant that specializes in specific fields.
Okay,
and
so
where that
words,
accessibility
in addition to having an access consultant, they might also have an engineering consultant that helps them with the sound issues or other kinds of
right.
things.
Yeah. For example, you know, we do a lot with multifamily residential, and they'll have an acoustical consultant that will tell them, you know, if they're next to a freeway, we need to have this type of a glass, right? And they have waterproofing consultants. So the architects are typically generalists, right? They understand conceptually what needs to happen, but then they'll pull in the appropriate specialists for whatever they're doing.
Now, do you find that some of the recommendations you give are at odds sometime to those of the other consultants?
I don't find that it's sometimes. I find that it's often at odds with what the architect is trying to do conceptually with the design, what the owner wants to do is with the cost, what the contractor wants to do because of ease of construction. So there are many times where our opinion is at odds with what their desires are. But we have, you know, our goal and our job is to give them the information and to let them know why the information is important. You know, why does that step pose a barrier or
and
things like that.
your aim is to help them meet the minimum requirements so
Yes.
they don't violate the law.
Correct.
And so they provide the greatest access possible given what they're trying to do.
Right. Right.
Okay. All right, we're here visiting with John Torkelson from the Access Partnership. We're going to take a break from Focus on Abilities, and we'll be right back with more after this message. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and we're here today with John Torkelson from the Access Partnership. John, we've talked about the work that you do with large projects, with architects who hire you as a consultant to help make sure their things meet the code and so on, but you also do a lot of work with smaller projects, even family homes. What about that?
Right. We deal with typically in the business side, we deal with larger commercial facilities, but there's also a need for accessibility in residential. And there's not an overarching code that requires single-family home buyers or single-family home developers to comply with certain things. But I am a member of an organization on the board of directors called Access Texas, or Access Homes, which is here in Texas. And it's an organization whose goal is to assist with developers and building contractors and architects to provide a level of accessibility, not full accessibility in single-family residential. We call it visitability, so that if you have a mobility impairment, a minor mobility impairment, be it temporary or permanent, or if you know someone, they can come in, use the home, and be able to enjoy the benefits of that home without any great expense of getting it corrected.
Now, I guess people are motivated to do that because they see the future, and the future means that if you live long enough, you're probably going to have some kind of disability, right?
Right, right. There's a joke in the code consulting business that we're all just temporarily able-bodied, right? You know, as we age, you know, the baby boomers are reaching that age where, you know, they get the aches and the pains, and they start getting minor disabilities where they may need a walker or a cane or something like that. There's also an issue that we have where you may be temporarily disabled, right? You may sprain an ankle or break a leg or something like that. And so it's a matter of not if, it's when. The big thing is also for the disability community on resale, right? Because there's a lot of people whose homes are not accessible, and if your home is accessible, we think that it increases the value of the home.
Well, and I guess that, you know, we went through a period of home building where people were doing things like sunken living rooms, which didn't make any sense whatsoever. If you had some kind of mobility impairment, it meant, in fact, you could never get into your living room.
Right.
And in fact, I'm aware of some where they've spent a lot of money and a lot of concrete filling up the sunken living room, right?
Right. And the goal is not to make it a fully accessible home. It's not to make it stand out. We're not installing grab bars or anything like that. It's just minimum things like having a zero-step entry where a person who has a mobility device could get into the house, having a bathroom that's large enough so that a wheelchair user can get in there and have the door closed behind them for some privacy. Things like that. They're very, very minimal expenses to have done in the house, but it provides a great deal of accessibility.
Well, and it probably also makes the home more adaptable so that if a person does become completely disabled at some point, requiring a wheelchair through all their daily activities, they can do the additional modifications at much less expense than they could if it hadn't been partly accessible.
Correct.
To begin with. I think the major expenses probably for a home builder would be the access to the entrance. So many homes are built with steps, and if you don't think about how you're going to get in with a mobility device before you put in steps, then you really have complicated your life.
Right.
The home we built has both steps and a long ramp, and you can't even tell the ramp is there behind the garden from the street.
Right. Again, if the earlier in the process you plan for it, the more integrated it is, and the better it is, and the cheaper it is.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people think about themselves and they make the assumption that they won't be disabled or they're not now, and they'll move if they have to, but they don't take into consideration family members, aging parents, maybe kids with disabilities, and so on, who they would like to have in their home.
Right.
John, the group you talked about was Access
Homes.
Okay.
And it's an organization, it's a nonprofit organization, and it's based here in Houston, and it's an organization whose goal is to spread the word, as it were, and to get to building owners, to get to contractors, developers, and architects.
But that's motivated, people's demands are motivated by good sense more than they are requirements or laws at this point.
There's no code requirement in the state of Texas for visitability. There are certain jurisdictions that do. Arizona, I think Austin actually does have a limited visitability law, but it's
also,
not.
I'm aware of Florida and New York.
Florida and New York, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. The other issues that you're involved in involve multifamily housing too, apartment buildings.
Right. One of the companies that we have multiple companies. One of the companies that we have deals specifically with multifamily residential. It's sort of a different scope, a different code than what the Access Partnership deals with. We're not dealing with commercial, we're dealing with multifamily residential. There, the requirements are sort of watered down. It's not as stringent as would be required if you have a public access, right? If we're just inviting the general public in, we don't know who is going to be in there and what type of a disability they will have, so we have to have a higher bar in the public accommodation.
These are the apartments that we refer to often as public housing, or this is a larger market?
We deal with both, right? We deal with public housing, which is Section 504 housing, that have a requirement. That requirement is greater as well than just private developments, right? A private apartment complex that gets built here in Houston, they're required to comply with the Fair Housing Act, okay? And the Fair Housing Act has a certain limited scoping that we have to do.
So that apartment, in other words, might not need to have as many units accessible as another one, or how does that work?
It doesn't have, there's no requirement for quote-unquote accessible units. There are requirements for adaptable units. The units have minimum clearances that are built into the design of the units based on where that unit is. If you can get to that unit and not have to traverse stairs, then essentially we have an accessibility requirement there, but it's an adaptable accessibility requirement. You can do a standard kitchen layout which has 36-inch countertops, and we just provide a parallel approach, right? So we're not doing the forward approach, full accessibility, but we have a minimum clearances that allow a person with a disability either to use that element or to modify it such that they could use it.
Okay. And it's modifiable at the expense of the...
It would be inside the unit, it's the resident's responsibility.
What about the bathroom, the shower, for example? If somebody moved in a unit like that had a bathtub in it, would they, in order to have a wheelchair accessible shower, they would have to remove the tub?
It would be the requirement of the resident. Now, there are some apartment owners that go above and beyond what's required, and many of my clients will do that. I mean, their job and their goal is to be as accessible as possible and to meet the needs of the community. But it is technically the requirements of the community or the resident.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and after the break, stay with us because we want to talk about some of the other motivating factors, what kinds of penalties the law has, and maybe also what some of the most egregious issues are that John faces as he's trying to make the world more accessible for all of us. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. I'm your host, Lex Frieden. We're here with John Torkelson from the Access Partnership. John, we've talked about big buildings, little buildings, homes, and so on. There are penalties for architects and builders and for commercial proprietors whose facilities are not accessible. And some of those are severe, correct?
Right. Yeah, there's basically two different ways that you can get in trouble by not complying. The federal laws, the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, were set up as civil rights laws. And so the way you get in trouble on the federal level, the way they set it up, was that if somebody feels they've been discriminated against and that their civil rights have been discriminated against, then they file a lawsuit, okay? And they'll file a complaint and they'll go through the federal courts. And that's expensive. And then at the end, the judge will basically make a determination on penalties there. It's not cheap. It's messy. It drags the clients or the person who has done the not built accessibly through the mud. We don't want that. On the state level, the state of Texas basically took the ADA and the requirements of the architectural or the accessibility guidelines, and they codified that and made it more like a building code. And that's what the Access Partnership does. They required the building owner to submit their plans prior to construction for review and then have an inspection afterwards. So there's a different sort of penalty there for non-compliance because we're actually going out in the field and we're checking to make sure that it's accessible. So if we have barriers there, then the state's going to look at the barriers that are existing and then make a determination of whether or not they want to pursue it. If it's a small issue like a sign is mounted an inch or two off, we would still put it in the report. State's probably not going to pursue that. But if it's a big thing, like we don't have accessible restrooms or their parking is inaccessible, then the state's going to pursue that through the administrative process. And there's administrative penalties of up to $5,000 per day per violation. It typically doesn't get to that point, but they have the legal ability to impose administrative penalties that can get quite expensive.
Now, John, it seems to me the advantage of the state code is that these code inspectors are obliged to check off whether or not the facilities are accessible, whether they meet the code, right?
Right, right. The difference between the state of Texas and there's a marked difference as an accessibility specialist. When I go inside the state of Texas and then I go outside the state of Texas, there's a marked difference of accessibility between the two, and that is because of the program that the state has, the Texas Architectural Barriers Act. It's not exactly the code specialist, it's a registered accessibility specialist. Either the state of Texas or a registered accessibility specialist will be somebody that will go out and do the plan review and do the inspection. And so it's somebody whose job is specifically for accessibility. In the other states, they rely on the building inspector who's worried about the building falling down or burning down to also sort of, hen and corral accessibility in there, and that's not really at the top of their list.
Now, what about remodeling? I know I go to a lot of restaurants, and sometimes the restaurants will make changes which I would think would cue them to improve their access, and yet they don't. And I'm wondering if anybody really looked at those the plans.
I would say that it's not a foolproof system, but typically if you do an alteration in the state of Texas that exceeds $50,000, you're obligated to submit those drawings for review and to have an inspection performed, which then would trigger, it depends on what we're altering, but if we alter a primary function, which would be the restaurant, then we have an obligation to look at 5 other areas, which is the accessible parking, the accessible route from the parking to the area that we've modified, the restrooms, drinking fountains, and if we provide public telephones. Those elements need to be brought into compliance.
Okay. And the other issue that I frequently run into, shopping in local establishments, is that, you know, I can get in and out of the store, but I can't get up and down the aisles. And yet these are portable kinds of fixtures.
Right.
What requirements are not being met there?
There is a requirement for an accessible route. The way that the federal guideline, the ADA and TAS is, there are certain requirements that we have for clear width. And then there's also some things that are, if it's a portable element that's movable, then we don't consider that because it is portable and it's readily moved. But if it's anything that's a fixed element, we do have an accessibility issue as far as having a 36-inch wide clear width, and I would say that that is a big thing. The problem comes in that when we do our inspections, typically it's right at grand opening, right? And then as time goes on, we only do one inspection. As time goes on, things do shift and move. So
Well,
it's
and
not that an inspection hasn't happened. It may be that they've changed things since.
But a building may even occur. I mean, they're not required to go back and get another inspection if they make some small adjustment. If they don't realize they're compromising the accessibility with that small adjustment, then they're in violation, and yet there was no system to catch them going out of violation.
Right, and if it's under $50,000, they're not required to submit. And so it sort of falls into the gray area of the ADA. Somebody needs to feel that they've been discriminated upon and feel strongly enough to file a lawsuit.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think a complaint works its way through the process.
Sure. Right.
And if people do run into that, one of the things I would suggest, I'm interested in your suggestion as well, but the Disability and Business Technical Assistance Center is 1-800-949-4232. And anybody, an architect that needs help, a lawyer that needs help, a person with a disability who needs to understand what their rights are under the law can phone that number and get consultation at no cost.
Correct. That's one of the best. I use that number a lot and refer a lot of people to that. You know, that's one of the best sort of first steps, not only to file a complaint and say, hey, you know, I feel that this is wrong, but also to make sure that you understand the scope of what's happening, you know, and the issues. You need to be informed. Yeah,
I guess the other important aspect of that is that the people at the technical assistance line can help you understand what law may have been violated by the people who you're trying to get access to.
Right.
John, this has been a very interesting discussion. I'm sorry that we're reaching the end of our program now, but before we conclude, I do want to ask you if you had 3 aspects of design that people who were building a restaurant, building a store, building a home needed to consider, what would they be?
So the 3 issues are the accessible parking and the accessible route into the building. Those are critical. Also, the restrooms are a critical element. Those are the ones that are sort of the telltale signs of have you done your job well. And then anywhere where a customer is going to interact with an employee or another customer, those are critical issues where we want to make sure that those are accessible.
And I guess it's a whole lot harder to do it, as you said, if the thing is already built and you're trying to fix it than it is if you do it right when you start.
Right. Full-scale models are great, but it's really bad to try to fix something once it's built. Your
company is called the Access Partnership. How do people reach you?
You can get a hold of me by my phone number, 512-476-8675, or my email is john@access-lp.com.
And website?
access-lp.com.
Okay, very good. We've been pleased to have John Torkelson as our guest today. At the beginning of the program, we asked a question, and that was what federal law requires access to private accommodations. We've talked a lot about that. Be sure to know about the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's one that's very important, but other laws as well will have an impact. So if you have an issue with access, if you need help making access better, if you feel like your life has been stymied by barriers that shouldn't be there, please get help. Call 800-949-4232 the Disability and Business Technical Assistance Center. Get in touch with John, and let's make the world more accessible to all of us with disabilities. Sure do appreciate you watching the program today. This is Focus on Abilities. We'll be back next time with more. And before we go, I want to thank HTV for being our sponsors and our hosts here, and I want to thank you all for watching. See you next time. Bye.